Malaysian government believes that for the 2016 Olympics in Rio the Olympic Committee should take an extra step in influencing the international community and set values which are determined to be part of what we believe as basic human rights. So, on this motion, our burden is that we want to prove that athletes should not be forced to follow religious obligations that may influence their performance when they compete in responsible game. And why? Because we believe that the Olympic Committee, as an international organization, has a role and a duty to facilitate this such punitive action. Now, our stance here is that we want to punish nations that force religious conflicts and force them to pay visit our to face action that force these religious actions down their athletes' throats. And we're going to move on with our mechanism. Now, firstly, we'll talk about how these countries, if they are found to be guilty or forcing their athletes to undertake religious obligations, they will not be allowed to enter the Olympics. And number two, what will happen is that the athletes will no longer be allowed to partake in these activities, and they will be part of the pool of the larger community as per what we do with international refugees. Now, some characterization here. First of all, let's talk about how these obligations will harm these athletes in the process. Now, before that, yes. Given the fact that this happens only once, and religion is wrong, right? Why is sport so important that religion then takes the backseat in this solution? Okay, now on to that, because we inherently believe that international communities, once even once before this, they have this spotlight shine on them, and that's why it is the best time for international communities to show their best face forward, to move their best foot forward. And because of that, we believe that this is where international communities, such as the Olympic Committee, take a step forward and impose this rule to ensure that we are able to say that, hey, we are an international coalition and we will not accept anything that's less explicit about it. We'll take anything that's less than what is deemed as minimum standard of human dignity. Now, back to my characterization. So, how this will help this process? Because, look, if we force, for example, right, force athletes to fast within Olympics, for example, what happened during the 2012 London Olympics? What happened was that the athletes who fasted, they went through exhaustion and they also severe dehydration. And what happens is that this does two things with that. One is that the critical nature of permanent injury. And number two, they will also, in the long run, impede their performance, which makes them perform worse during the sport itself. Now, this is like when you look at the Islam as a religion, for example, right? If you have obligation to fulfill under your country's flag, then your religious obligations do take a backseat. For example, if you have a position to perform front, a civic duty to perform, then this will individual of fast. And furthermore, even if when it comes to praying, if you miss out praise, even Islam has some sort of compensation. If you cannot pray within that specific time, then when you do that, but you can pray some other time. This is already within the tenets of Islam. And we believe that these countries should not take such extreme positions in terms of forcing their players to conduct their religious obligations, which within the religion does not exist in the first place. So, now, back to my first point, which is to be part of the international community means that we must adhere to international standards and values. Now, okay, so all of the countries that are working on things, right, what's happening is that when you're working, they want to show off that they are the best people. We want to push the best side of the people. So there is some parent state at the end of the line. So if they are able to get a goal capital, that means that hey, under this spot that we have been able to be the best at this thing. So using that, we should say that, you know what, if you want to get a gold medal, you need to get international standards as to how you treat your feelings, as to how you treat your activities, to ensure that at the end of the day, we are able to not force this barbaric standards of religion down. Yes, this goes, and everyone can start. Now, what happens is that when international okay, moving on. The international community also cannot encourage the countries to oppress the athletes, which is why we see this as a form of oppression towards the athletes. You see, because when you have to pronounce these obligations, despite take fulfill these obligations, what's going to happen is that if we, as the English community, as the Olympics committee, decide that we will sit by and watch them go through their training while being put under severe stress and severe harm, which comes from religious obligations, what's going to happen is that means the Olympic committee is also complicit on the oppression that this country is forcing down the experts. And with that, we believe that Olympic committee does have to do and that sports is really easy. It mix with a lot of different people, and you make it mix with a lot of different cultures. But the important thing about this is that we need to tolerate, understand, and realize that the differences individuals come from, the differences individuals have, and we cannot judge or put our people there and let them be the way they are. The moment we can do this, the moment we can start to be tolerant with society as a whole of different cultures, we think that is why we shouldn't have. Few responses to this are asked. If I show you why this policy is problematic, right? So, very quickly, right? Number one, we ask a very strategic question because we ask them why is sports taking a backseat? There are responses because there is a spotlight put on these countries, which means that the spotlight that which is put on the Olympic committee during this Olympic is not that we are a unit which is mutual, inclusive of everybody. It's a pro-West movement that is against any form of individuals who have religious obligations which exist in society and religious obligations as a whole. That's a problem, right? You need to tell us in the past how we still allow people to participate where they don't know the same thing part, why that is essentially the part is so problematic, and why this is essentially the future. Because in order for you to do this debate, you need to compare the fact that in the past we allowed this. So what is the big revelation that has happened which suddenly warrants this debate, right? Because in the past everybody was understanding. Yes, there was a certain amount of disagreement, but this was happened, and then essentially will show you why this was fine, but why should we need to listen to this as a whole. Second thing, right? We came up here and told you that no stuff, that sounds right. When we fast and you want to say you're exhausted, and you go there. Two responses to this. Number one, you need to realize that this is the culture of the people on the ground, right? It's a religion, it's something which goes every single day, which means to a certain extent these individuals would have already realized from a young age that this is something they have to go through, and they would naturally realize, want to still take part in whether I want to still continue, right? So there's certain extent you need to realize if I'm willing to go for this stuff, then it's my consent as a whole. But even if you need to realize that this is not something which is one of us, right? Oh, you're going for sport, we are going to do this onto you, right? That's the difference. It's something which happens all the time. You need to know why in one of instances is so important that we condemn your culture which exists at the whole. Because this is actually we condemn the culture of an individual where it's a very fundamental belief in the individual. So no. Also the second thing, right? You came up here and talked alternatives, right? Alternatives is you can create different plans. Exactly right. To show to you how this will happen when countries start to get more like popular, get more better sport, and how they themselves get moderate and more. So why is it important to leave it to these individuals? No, on to my first point, on why organic change is essentially important, right? Now, you need to realize that a lot of people essentially like got involved in sport in the past and were very religious, right? Because they saw sports be a one-off thing and they saw religion to be more important. Now, when they got more involved in this kind of things and more active, they realized that certain things can be like implemented around and certain things can change. What they mean by this, right? So when it comes to, like, for example, when certain countries started getting much better at certain sports, they realized that certain values and certain beliefs were essentially detrimental to the success and progress of the sport. That means those individual countries on the world decided that they can change this. Malaysia, like not just Malaysia, but most countries which had these sorts of things, right, had strict rules and strict things in the past, right, where you can or you cannot play this, or if you play, you still have to pass as a goal, right? But over time, we realized that it's detrimental to the sport. So what the countries which have changed are moderate countries whose journey on the ground have come to this. The problem here is that at the end of the day, these are moderate countries which change. Your side essentially like discriminates and pushes all the other radical countries to the side. Because you need to realize in order for organic change to happen, no, it needs to happen systematically. Right? We think the problem here is that you have a ripple effect and negative ripple effect. Why? Because the moment you have this policies, you now have the country to grow. Okay, we believe culture is so important and we would rather do it as a, let's say, we don't sport. The moment you start doing this, right, the ripple effect is that there's less of like discussion on what things can be hold on to, what things are important, and what things we can move on to, right? So for example, like discussion on really in this kind of situation, is it okay for them to play later, right? And this kind of thing. The important part here is that it then has a triple down effect. Because if you are willing enough to have a discourse what certain things in religion which you don't see is important and are willing to circumvent, is then triple down to certain things. Like for example, women in Saudi Arabia. So this is because you allow like people to not wear hijabs in sport, then there can be a certain discussion in the future on those people around that you allow like women on the ground to like try and start. There's a ripple effect which then changes how people naturally think because it sets a precedent for this. Before I go on to my second point, yeah.
So if countries that are joining the after you work out in Qatar, does that mean that all these countries will not follow human rights record as a
Look, the problem here is that human rights is not religious based, right? I think it's religious based, it's based on the culture. Both things are different, right? It's completely different. It's not something which happens in society and religiously inoculated. No. Secondly, Western imposition and how this will be seen as bad, right? The thing which you need to realize is that you cannot just stand sitting and push these people aside. Why? The people which is involved in their politics, the Olympic Committee. This Olympic Committee of the world is not accountable to the people on the ground in places like Saudi Arabia. The government is. So the moment you stand with people with this and you force them to comply, and if they do comply, there will be backlash from the people on the ground because the government has accountability to the people. So if people on the ground just generally aren't ready to let women take part without the hijab or whatever, then there will be backlash towards the government, and this is a problem because you're putting your Western ideas out. So the moment you put these Western ideas out, the people on the ground will look at the government as like changing because of Western imperialism. The problem here is that you need to realize that the standards which you put on those individuals is not something which you put like for fun, right? It's based on morality in society. You also need to draw the parallel here because in most countries you allow them to decide what is okay, what is not. So we have countries banning certain players from taking part in sports, like amazing players taking part in sports, right? If you, for example, if you drink, if you smoke, if you have discipline issues, right? Things which is not naturally circumvented by the Olympic Committee, but each country decides where it's at. Both those regulations and stuff is based on people on the ground. And it's the same thing here, right? We're wearing a hijab and taking part in the sport is based on the people on the ground. Which means that the problem here is that it's based on the morality standards, the standards of morality which is consistent in society. This means that they're not doing it for fun, and there's a justified reason why they're essentially doing this. At the end of the day, the reason why they do this is also because their morality reflects how society as a whole is. So, if society is not ready for such things, then they will naturally morality, their sense of morality will not push to accepting these kind of things. But as countries like Malaysia are a little bit more modern and they're okay with this kind of thing, our society as a whole is pushing to change standards of morality. So we think at the end of the day, it's not like this is such a bad thing. It's reflective of the morality, the people on the ground, and all of this, right? You need to tell us how this, why then is it okay to ban this, but not okay to ban other countries who prevent this from taking part just because they smoke, they drink, and etc. Thank you.
Thank you.
Madam Chair, it is bad enough that the theocratic regimes hold the throats of their citizens within their borders, and we should not allow those clauses extend to Saudi to let them stay in Saudi Arabia. Let's look at several examples before I move into my arguments. First, is this a form of Western imposition to law? Firstly, we say no, if all the values that we apply onto one extreme ideas when it comes to religion, because we've already explained in the first video that it's not engaged, that whatever interpretation that they should not actually pass, they should actually pass within the period of the Olympics, is an extreme interpretation of what religion is. So all the values that are imposed here are forms of collective values, or universal values, that the rest of society, that even when it comes to religious countries like Malaysia, we allow for exemptions. So considering that moderate countries already hold these values and see these values are part of the international standard, that means these collective values are not just Western ideas, but a collective idea that the rest of the world holds. Second of all, even if it's a form of Western imposition, the question becomes, are you then fine with these countries continuously oppressing their own people up to the point where they are supposed to go through dehydration, right? Dehydration, and there's a possibility they might die in the process. Western or not, that is a moral value that we need to actually stand up for. But the third idea that I push here is the idea of backlash people in Saudi Arabia. Firstly, that happens with everything that happens when you directly contradict with the moral values that people have. Now, if you allow governments to actually directly question the tenets of the religion, because they start questioning when my ethics can be part of the society, that's when you allow some form of top-down change. There's a reason why we have things like state clerics when it comes to Saudi Arabia, because that's when we get people to actually come down and actually listen to what the clerics say and justify within the situations. Considering that, and also there's already precedents that a lot of Muslim countries that have already moderated their stance, there's also a possibility that this backlash can be well with the clerics justifying things using the Quran or whatever religious text that they want to have. Thirdly, secondly, under this level, is that standards of morality change from time to time. And we believe that this can only happen if these countries were actually moderate in the first place. But how do these countries become moderate? It's when they decide to become part of the international community, when they actually crave for some form of international contention to this extent. So when you deny form access, like for example, a country like Qatar, if you force them to not actually host the World Cup and the rest of the world boycotts it, that's when they will start questioning about the labor abuses that they happen over there. So that means the standard of morality would also change within that period, and they are willing to change within it. So considering that precedent, that can also be extended to countries like Saudi Arabia. What I'm going to talk about? I'm going to talk about two things. Firstly, how the West or even general community, international community cannot be complicit to the actions of oppressions of countries like Saudi Arabia. And second of all, I'm going to talk about how this will change these countries in general before I move on how they do so.
So many of the advocates in this country already want value.
If they want to, then that's fine. But if they do not want to, then the countries should not actually push this kind of ideas towards this country in general. There are a lot of people who want to choose that Algerian athletes who do not actually who are not actually obliged to actually fast, but they still fast if they want to. Firstly, how the West becomes complicit in actions of oppression. Because first, let's take again the example of a person going through severe dehydration. That person's life is at stake, and he is literally exercised to near death. One of my greatest phobias. But somehow, this is all ridiculous because even vengeance give some form of leeway. For example, in Islam, if you were to go to war, you are still allowed to not actually fast and drink water because God understands that you may go through some form of dehydration. Algeria does not actually impose anything towards the athletes, but Saudi Arabia do. So that shows the problem here is not because of the religion itself, but the problem is because of the extreme interpretation that is people impose, and that's the culture that you cannot actually support. So what happens here, the conclusion is that when you continuously allow them to do so and they get rewarded as a part of it, that means you are complicit towards the actions of the people and you're forcing them onto their death. The second level to this is that they question, will the people moderate on their own? We say no, because that is contingent on whether the country wants to be globalized in the first place. And considering that you want to be part of the international community, that means there is a push for them to actually follow what it is. The problem here is that you constantly reward them for their actions, hence they do not actually take into consideration what really athletes want. For example, Saudi Arabia is still allowed to play within the World Cup despite whatever actions they have. So within their mind, they wouldn't have been actually calculate whether they should actually do something with my participants or not. Because I'm still able to carry out the stage and I'm still able to force people to go through this harsh conditions and still actually be part of the World Cup. So within their mindset is that they wouldn't mind sacrificing the health of their players as long as they get their gold medal. But when it comes to sports, it's not just the idea of getting the gold medal, but sports is also contingent on seeing what is the condition on the athlete at that point. It's the international camaraderie where you take care of your brothers instead. So when you continuously allow Saudi Arabia to do so, you take away this idea of camaraderie where we take care of the people who are also athletes, who are part of the beautiful game, and you condemn them into an existential prison. But at that level, this is ridiculous also, and because the international community has already condemned people when it comes to death or injuries when it comes to other sectors. Let's say, for example, when it comes to labor abuse in Qatar or even the upcoming Russian Olympics, or in past also within the Sochi Olympics, where we condemn the unfair construction practices, where actually taking cheap labor from all over the place, but yet we apply a double standard when it comes to Saudi Arabia forcing their players to actually follow religious obligations. If we are already against these human rights abuses that is applied in these conditions, that means we must also have the same standard when it comes for them on the field at the end of the day. But here's the second level of the MIDP. So how exactly are they going to change? We have to understand countries like Russia or Qatar still actually crave international contention. That is why even the most despotic regimes want to be part of sports. If you deny them the ability to become a sport, that's when the athletes will actually question all their coaches, and their coaches will pick this up even higher, and maybe people from the world actually rethink about their policies. We're seeing great precedents. Let's say, for example, in South Africa, we did not allow them to actually be part of the Rugby World Cup, and that sort of made them rethink about apartheid in general. But second example is like how when the Soviet Union wanted to actually host the Olympics before, countries like Malaysia and the rest of the non-aligned movement decided not to send their teams to the Soviet Union, and that made them rethink about the conditions for the despotic regime. And within that, it already creates the discourse from the people on the ground and also the people on the ground who may tell their clearings to rechange or redirect the discourse in general. So that completes the debate about backlash on their side. Ladies and gentlemen, on our side, we need to help the push when it comes to countries to become moderate, and we cannot be complicit to the torture and possible deaths of these athletes in the future, both for the government and great Malaysia. Yeah.
Give them to start for later. See you health, terrorism, science, ladies and gentlemen, these are the points that have brought up as extreme as we found. He said that Saudi Arabia telling the players to wear hijab and fast is equivalent to apartheid. Even that is equivalent. Apartheid is something that's objectively horrible that we all agree upon. Fasting is something that's considered by all Muslims to be a good act, wearing hijab is something to be a good act, and you can't tell them otherwise because they believe it or in that. Anyway, in the most extreme example, it talks about fasting. Well, a good solution to that would be to not force the game during fasting. But what he does not recognize is for the nations that he specifically targets, he specifically targets extremely conservative nations like Saudi Arabia. But what is the mindset of people on the ground in Saudi Arabia, which he never analyzed? He assumed most of these players don't want to pass. He assumed most of these people don't want to wear hijab. But this is that's true. When President goes in, Saudi Arabia asked, will they be passing during the World Cup game? He said, yeah, it's because sport starts today and ends tomorrow. But I have a religion and I have a God to answer to the rest of my life. And this is the same sentiment that is shared among every single player, irregardless of what the state tells you. A religion is concrete. A religion is something that is believed by everyone. When you ask football players who they like to thank, the first people they like to thank is God. Irregardless of state sanctioning or not, in both these conservative countries that we talk about, the empathy on the ground and the rationale on the ground is people want to do. So we don't think that as much as justified automatically character the states that you won't do on them, people are already accepted it. But let's talk about what states hasn't accepted it, that will be in by extension. Then it talks about we like that these countries create international legitimacy and they want that legitimacy. We say that ownership can happen better outside. Why? Because to get the international legitimacy and to get the attention you want, you need to win. You can't be shit. So when you need to win, and especially considering that you need people with performance, this is pushed from the ground on the people inside. The people that you talk about that don't want to do they don't want to wear hijab and bring something to their coaches on their own. So this won't be seen like an outsider trying to attack individually and a country's religion. It will look like someone saying their own country how to improve itself in sport. And this is how they get the international legitimacy. They will see that this is what we need to win. And we need to back this up. If not, we won't be winning. On their side, I'll tell you what, even more problem. So they said that, at least don't want to do this. It's a very bad example. But Ministry of Athletes, even in nations that won't force them to this, choose to do that. Saudi Arabia, Brazil, Stefan Al-Sharawi. Individuals are in countries that need them to do this, but they choose to do it. That is second from the back. What if consumption view is extremely important? We're talking about how organic change happens. And not organic change happens better on our side. And we're talking about defining very briefly with Western position. And the West is telling you to do something. And because all the examples and the debate is circling around the Muslim religion, it's problematic because there's already huge sensitivity within the West. And the burqa was banned in front. When other countries were taking steps towards imposing on people within their own nation how they should live their life, Islam is being pushed to backwards and they aren't allowed to moderate. The conservatives are willing to clear argument and less people are willing to moderate because of people like you who don't let them have the organic change they can't talk about. Let me move in myself that before you question. Two questions. Sit down, please. Number one, how does the harm to religious activity that are already chosen to get and how you alienate, you marginalize and alienate them? Again, I'm not helping to investigations how they would react to these sorts of sanctioning ban and why this conditions. And then, how religious bodies and religious practices within nations would react and how does galvanize them to want to be against the Western world. Considering that this needs to be looked in the perspective of which is best for the Olympic Games, that is the tangent that we would like to do and one more is I will decide that believing to be fair, atheists and agnostic individuals will be excluded from sports. Number one, most people in these countries don't become openly atheists. So we don't see where the problem is going. It's not a real non-issue. Whatever people know. How is harm religious activity? Number one, there have been enough work that is not this athletes that don't want to just come up and moderate everyone. But the question is, parents are services before. Yes, we have. In countries like Indonesia and Malaysia, but before this, there was believed by law that you cannot break the fast during the month of Ramadan. But over time, in Malaysia, we don't share the law. It is exclusion. But if they want to go, the fatwas will be made to say that competing in sport is just like representing a nation in the art of war. You can't break the fast, it isn't necessary. Why? Because the push happened from within. And this is the same changes that we want to continue within this the nation that we talk about. And the players, the coaches, the push for it themselves, it happens on a better level. But secondly, we also make these individuals within the nation seem that they don't care about their sport. So now they're born within two different entities. Either they see that they're representing the nation and they're good sportsmen, or they see you can be a religious person, you're not a good sportsman. We don't think these things happen that I talk about. When the Iman team that's so well in are all covered in hijab, we are celebrating that that's good. Because it breaks down the stereotype that hijab makes us lower, that hijab affects the play, And Iran is happy to do that. But other Muslim countries don't need to follow suit. So I honestly believe individuals within the country will have their own empathy and they will react to it. And that's how we should want it. But now let's talk about the nation and the religious bodies that control the nation. And we see that there is a form of structure within religion in how Saudi Arabia, because they have the Hajj, when fatwas are released, are generally accepted and viewed on. What do you now allow Saudi Arabia to do? Allow Saudi Arabia to get the Olympic Committee. These are the devils that are trying to make you use the religion. They are the individuals that want to make you forget about your God that will give you the That is a problem because now you further, number one, you make it to reinvent the narrative that the West is against you. That all Islam weak individuals, and they're trying to find the best way to send you help and hamper your ability to achieve your ability. That is a problem because if you allow religious bodies, especially strong religious bodies, to immediately react with no thought whatsoever, with using language immediately triggers the biggest problem. You make it seem like the West position is suddenly very careful and you don't allow organic change. Because now the narrative will be, if you support this, you are a person that does not support us and you will be going to help. We don't allow the moderation because immediately the idea of organic change or the idea that not wanting to partner, we find what the West wants you to do and you will be considered an enemy, and that's why you have organic. I think very problem.
Islamic nation, or I will feel that we do not wish to comply with each and every single Islamic regulation, especially during a sport where we do not think that your state has any ability to compel you to do so. We think that the IOC is complicit in allowing states to do that we hold for morality in the state, and we do not hold. But more than that, by coming to holding up, we're going to tell you how this policy, number one, is more likely to moderate sort of extreme interpretation of we're going to tell you why it is harmful for us to sacrifice meritocracy in the name of religion. But lastly, we're going to tell you why the IOC is in the best position to be able to put it for this sort of change. After a draw comparison with other efforts. Before that, let's first deal with the opening of this, right? Because there's a couple things I want to talk about. Let's first deal very quickly with the idea of the Western imposition hierarchy, which I've got a very double background. The first thing to say is we think that to a certain extent it is a trade-off that we have to make. The tangible harm that was substantiated in reputation was that athletes were denied or actively have morality of the state. Most of them, and we covered that athletes is the point. And we think we trade off, we're okay with holding a certain degree of morality because we think we protect the athletes on the ground. It's a trade-off we make. But then we have to draw the parallel with drinking and smoking. We don't think this is analogous, right? I think the number one is that for things like smoking and drinking are bad habits that you can change at this. The religion is something that is intensely personal to you, and you cannot change it without a great degree of harm and self-denial, right? We also think that smoking actually hurts your athletic ability compared to other things. The next thing I want to talk about was organic change and internal change, right? We think that just because something was done in the past doesn't mean it needs to be continued in the future. And here that half of that, we don't think that should happen. But Mitchell responded, right? He said that, oh, the athletes will complain. This is a check and balance we really need to change. We don't think so. We think the athletes are coerced in this sort of circumstance. They cannot opt out, right? Because sports are their livelihood and been training for their life. It is the source of income. The moment which they leave sports, the moment which they become a poor person or they're unable to access certain opportunities in life. We think that is the point where people cannot opt out and that they would rather compromise and have to conform or have been forced upon them rather than fight it, right? This means that your check and balance is fake. But the last thing he told us was that, oh, religious activities are. Look, this this policy, right, we are not forcing people who want to be religious to stop being religious. If you feel that wearing a hijab is empowering towards you, if you feel that wearing a hijab is empowering towards you, you can wear your hijab. It's empowering for your identity. This depends on those people who don't want to wear a hijab. You can hurt the ethnic community and they do not want to identify with sort of religion. But then they say the Saudi Arabia will point at ISU at the level. We don't think so. We think that most people who are affected by the policy were very religious to start with, so they're not going to be antagonized. If you are so religious, you think that you will still continue wearing hijab, you will not stop from doing so. Even if some people get antagonized or some people get offended. We feel that there's a greater incentive for people to watch sports. I think there's a greater incentive for people because people like watching sports. Real competition is so good. And we feel at the end of the day, they're more likely to take this to the positive side rather than react negatively. Before I move to the next section, sure. So, one people want to push for moderation. We like to the Westerners or considered assholes and belong to the world. That is not true because the way in which we are pushing for change, because sports is the most effective medium to push for moderation. Let me tell you why right now. Why is sports the best medium to push for moderation? Because sports is the platform for people to test us to fight to see who is the best at this. We think that because of the spirit of competition, this platform is inclusive, right? But more than that, it's often influential when people look up to certain sports ideas that they don't have to do like. We also think, right, that conservative people also like watching sport. We don't think that conservative people don't like football. We also think that because it's such a competitive platform, it's also neutral. We think it's unfair for certain nations to prioritize religious value over the athletic ability of the athlete. It goes against the spirit of God and harms the athlete in three ways. Number one, to exclude certain members of certain athletes from certain classes because you feel that they're not religious enough for you. It's unfair for you to exclude them on the sole basis of their religion. Number two, you deter other people from the similar class from joining sport, which means that your sports class becomes an exclusive class for the religious people in your church or in your mosque. You can practically harm to the thirdly, you deny those people who really want to play sport, who do not belong in your exclusive class, the opportunity for joining sport. This means that they will never have access to competitive arena in this that is all good for them, that is better. So anyways, the point is that on the outside, it's easier to fight against such discrimination because the platform we use in order to push for change is not biased, it's neutral, and it is inclusive. Sit down. How do we push for change? At the point at which the IOC says that a certain nation can create action against nations that force their athletes to be religious, we need to generate a sort of this force, and because it's a form of controversial action, right? It creates discourse and awareness amongst conservative nations. But over and above what opening government talks about, we need that this discourse is particularly beneficial. At the point at which we are going to raise awareness within the nation, we're able to actively get people to question the belief, question the faith, actually talk about, think about why are we forcing people to do this sort of thing. This is the point at which the awareness actually leads to organic change on the ground. This is the form of change that we want to push for. But actually, let's draw the comparative between other forms of focus practice setup. We think that under status quo, the religious community has no incentive to moderate. But on the outside, there's a huge incentive because if they don't moderate, they won't be able to participate in sports. We think that other means of moderation are harder because there's ineffective conditions of morality because the methods that we use are not neutral, right? We talk about giving aid, for example, there's seen right? So comparatively, outside is better able to push for moderation. Secondly, why do we sacrifice? Why is sacrifice religion? We do not think that religion has anything to do with your athletic ability. We think that non-religious people, atheists, and people from different religions are just as capable of being good athletes as everyone else. We think that because nations push, because of this, right, it's bad for nations to push for such measures that impose priorities. The harms are threefold. Number one, the sports community will be worse off because they will not be able to access the best degree of competition. So at the end of the day, when you exclude certain athletes from the field, or when you exclude certain of the better athletes from the field, the degree of competition will not be as deep as it could have been. But secondly, we think that athletes have denied opportunities. We're talking about systematic discrimination of the people. Actively anti-denying people on the ground, especially those people who don't subscribe to your form of morality, and you disincentivize them from joining sports. Third, how the image of the country in the national scale, we think that the point at which your nation is seen as something that's more religious than meritocratic, that's the point at which your image in the national sphere is harmful. Comparatively, the outcome we want is for these people to be moderated, for people to respect the rights of the athletes, for all of these reasons So our opening talk about organic change in backlash. Primarily, this conversation is being centered around a more domestic view of this. But we realize that none of the teams in this room have really talked about how relationships between countries actually change under this policy. And we will list out a few extensive analysis on this policy, right? Four extensions. Firstly, on the right of nations for self-determination. Secondly, on the role of national athletes in propagating national pride. Thirdly, the effect of punitive measures towards these countries, and fourthly, what is essential in the Olympic Council to maintain and neutral stance in this aspect, right? But before that, I will talk about the Olympic Constitution, right? So, coming from part of the mission of the government, we asked us, are we okay with the discrimination, or we asked them, are we okay with discrimination of atheists in this country? And also say how sport is the best medium to push moderation. However, the analysis never suggested that there was the case. What we gather from side of the population is that your policy doesn't solve discrimination on the social level either, because you're never able to affect the way individuals regard these national athletes in the very first place, right? But we think that the trade-off that they will not able to comprehend is that you end up pushing these nations away from the exposure to the international community they were participating in and moving towards being more regular in the first place. Talk about the importance of people enjoying such sports and using those sports. But we also tell you that the enjoyment of the sport is easily diminished when they feel their athletes they compete for their nation and the Olympics not truly representative of what their core beliefs or religious populations are. Right? What is opening talk about? The opening talk about Olympic concept is the powerful view why that is actually maintaining a neutral stance without this kind of norms. Let's talk about what effects of the policy. They consider that if an athlete or if a country has particular strict religious obligations because they have world athletes, they give religious obligation, the country will not be allowed to participate in the Olympics, right? Firstly, we think that it hasn't been unfair for the other athletes in that very same sport. Secondly, we think that it leads to the degradation of the sport in that very country. Why is that harmful? For example, we think football in Nigeria, right? Where sports is banned by the Boko Haram. What Nigerian government has been doing is that they take captured Boko Haram members in an effort to reform and rehabilitate them through playing football, right? In order to break the kind of radical domination. But at the very same time, conservative nations like Nigeria may not be fully comfortable with athletes that cross their religious population on a global level. They may not really have that kind of exposure. But we think that they're still making incredible efforts to dominate sports through fighting the very same radicalizations that these people are against, right? And also to talk about holding religious nations to an international standard of security. And that will be the argument by the discussion. Right? The right of nations is self-determination. Opening talk about organic change of nations, we will talk to you about how nations have the best interest to represent the people and the effect they have on society. Right? We get firstly, religious obligations are representing on the identity of the nation. The expression of the least important and central to their lives, right? So the behaviors, characters of the athletes or kids at the Olympic level affect the entire nation and its people. Why we think it's important to self-determination and we differentiate ourselves, right? That on a national level, it's the most powerful level of representation. So people of that nation are able to affect change through the ballot or through other political means, right? Or when policy is changed through bullying by the World Olympic or world bodies like the Olympic Council, the value of that change, the value of that organic change is lost, right? Whereas the value of these nations can change over time. And I think that most Muslim countries allow their athletes to spend their past, for example, doing sporting events anyway. So the harms are not exaggerated as what the government side trying to believe, right? But on the question that's engage them at their level, right? How on national athletes themselves. We think that they're not no longer just athletes when they participate in the Olympics, they become public icons. It's essential that they're relatable to the people, relatable to the nation, and people they represent, right? Because even assuming the policy is implemented in the nation, certainly it's likely these athletes will not be celebrated for their return, right? And it doesn't change the mindset of these world people in the very first place, right? But we also think that national athletes are a form of national pride, and the value of their experience is marked by athletes that people feel do not ultimately represent them, right? We
think that thirdly, also athletes consent to competing under these conditions, right? Just as different countries have different challenges, we believe that athletes are also able to overcome these inconveniences and they have consented by competing for their country. So again, the harm we talked about already consented, right? So, but thirdly, right, how do that punitive measures drive individuals away from participating in secular events, right? Firstly, we think that by their punitive measures, by excluding a country from the Olympics, it is further divide in religious and secular issues, right? Firstly, we think the lack of engagement on a mutually competitive and constructive level. Secondly, we think that you're also condemning religious nations for their beliefs. Haven't stated that the religious countries become secular when they decide to join the international community. Yes, exactly. Uncoerced decision is essential in this case. When you threaten human action to provoke a response, no response whether it will be removing religious obligation or not. No response would be ultimately beneficial for the athlete or for that nation or right? Also, I think they have known religious radicalization, right? It breeds further resentment among hardliners in their country. So even when policymakers came into demand of the Olympic Council, it has been training their identity of that particular religion. I think their hardliners are able to use that country in their own hands for
Now, the one sort of bureaucratic state takes less of an importance in comparison to an individual. But the question is, where would this athlete gain more political capital? In a world where they will be behind you into sections and that mistake, or when one person is fighting the system, when his religious integration is not accepted. I think there are rights and desires for an athlete. Firstly, I really told you how it's not as bad as it is, right? There are a lot of athletes that offer encouragement. Secondly, I'm very told you how this athletes consent to the other solutions. And thirdly, we think that even if they do not, the moment you represent your country in the Olympics, that maybe your national identity and pride may take precedence over your individual one. And unfortunately, a trade-off that we are happy to make outside. Right? But lastly, the importance of the Olympic Council taken into start for issues. We believe that the Olympic Council needs to be a third-party mediator and only exist to ensure that the rules of fair play are upheld and enforced. Right? Also to be as representative as possible. To determine the best interests of each region, have to be inclusive of both religious and conservative elements, which is something that this side chooses to engage. Right? Ultimately, the purpose of the Olympics is to transcend politics and ideology. Right? That's why we have countries like Israel and Palestine competing on the same platform. India and Pakistan competing on the same platform, even though they may be or have been engaged in value warfare, right? The ability to compete on the platform is essential, right? So we ensure that even in conflict, and not all times I'm highly seven. Unfortunately, the reality that side government is engaging is when you impose punitive measures on these countries, ultimately exclude them from competing in the one platform where neutrality, where the transcendence of ideology and political will is supposed to be implemented. For all those reasons, we think that these countries will be resolved. The athletes that will make these countries will be resolved here.
In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, Father God, bless me, for I have sinned, and please forgive me, for I do not know my wrongdoings, and I have no other options. Madam Chair, against this debate needs to be all from individuals and countries that constantly oppress non-religious individuals, or individuals that might not necessarily have like the best form of religion, or like the state's imposition of what religion is, and make that a prerequisite for entering into this form. Because this means, Madam Chair, that more often than not, if you do not comply with the religious values that the state imposes on you, you are not allowed to go for a tournament. The moment when you are not seen as the best Muslim or the best Christian, you are not allowed to go for that tournament. You are not allowed to participate in that country. We think this is abhorrent, and it deters individuals from wanting to join sport, something that was never really engaged by the entire bench of Malaysia. I have three issues. Firstly, will this model protect people more? Secondly, is this model then beneficial for individual sports? And thirdly, which side then best aids in the form of moderation, and which side is better than discussed? But before that, I have 3 points to rebuttal, which directly clashes with the extension that came out from Borneo opposition. They argue that individuals are not ready to expose themselves to these values. But we think that if you don't impose this now, this will never happen. You allow a perpetuation of the conservative values for an individual. If you allow these individuals to use the excuse that we are not ready now, we don't think that we don't need this individual to ever be this system, right? Given the characterization, given the characterization of the entire offense was that these individuals uphold their religion so dearly and this like their prerogative in life, we don't think that you are then as these individuals would necessarily be ready for exposure. But second of all, they argue that nations will turn themselves away from sports. We don't think so. We think that nations place a lot of importance on Olympics, right? There's not a lot of people who did for it. Or like individuals that really want to stand in athletes to enter the Olympics. So by placing these punitive measures, you don't then deter individuals from wanting to go to sports. But even if we think that this is a necessary trade-off that we need to make. At that point in time, when you are harming your athletes or when you deny opportunities from other athletes who entering this tournament, we think you are harming and antagonizing the non-religious community within your country. No, thank you. They said that individuals won't necessarily be able to enjoy, right? And the self-determination of the country will be detrimental. But we don't think so. We think that the comparative is simple. Why then are you allowing these athletes to be the pawn of your social engineering? To allow these athletes to be entertained, the form of entertainment for your people within your country. We think this is extremely detrimental because at that point in time, when you force these individuals to uphold the value of your nation, it's extremely harmful. Rather, we think that at that point in time, when you allow these individuals to pick and choose whether or not they feel that their religion is that complying within the circumstances, rather you make them more relatable to the public sphere. Because it is more like models on the ground we have to relate to these individuals, right? It's easier for these people to identify, oh, maybe Islam is such an extreme religion after all, because they make concessions for these individuals under certain circumstances within an article of self-determination doesn't fly. Firstly, will this model protect more people? Don't thank you. We think that it will. We didn't spot all that you're not allowed to exclude individuals by basis of your religion. We did it at that point in time. We passed this model to excluding non-religious communities, the non-religious communities, or the communities that don't necessarily comply to your standards. What happens then? Number one, you place an unfair prejudice to those that were excluded. You antagonize them, you downplay their achievements, and you force them to be seen as an athlete that isn't allowed to represent the country, mainly because he wasn't good enough. When in actual fact, it was because he doesn't worship Allah enough, or doesn't pray to Jesus every night for his things, right? Because it's extremely harmful in that sense because it antagonizes individuals that were excluded. But it needs to exist above and beyond that. No, thank you. At that point in time, we recognize that sport influences people on the ground. When young children look to these athletes and say that, why am I not allowed to be a part of a sports arena just because I don't think I need to pray Allah like during my prayer or whatnot, right? Or I don't necessarily need to fast all the time. We didn't at that point in time to constantly antagonize people. What does this mean? The problem that exists when number one, people, children, or like you perpetually recycle that sport is exclusive and is only for communities that comply to the standards of the state. You remove the form of meritocracy that sports is supposed to be about. We think that's very harmful. But second of all, you make religion extremely impersonal. This was like this extension never getting engaged in. We can at that point in time when the state imposes a value upon your religion and tells you how you are supposed to live your life as a Muslim, as a Christian, you remove the personalization of religion that they so wanted to protect. That means that you don't respect an individual's autonomy in determining whether or not a religion is beneficial for them. What then happens under this model? You create more unrest on the ground, you make people antagonize each other because the non-religious communities are more likely to antagonize the religious communities and vice versa. Because they are going to think that they are being taken away from opportunities that's actually harmful. But second of all, you crystallize religious views. This at that point in time when the ISOC is complicit to the act and knowing that a lot of states deny access to these individuals, deny access to the athletes, constantly oppress that, you crystallize these views because you view as this view is legitimate because you know the harm, but you don't want to act upon it. It's extremely harmful, not something the closing government is willing to support. Before that, I'll take closing.
See, how will a child under your paradigm become their sporting idol when there's no longer any relationship between them and that idol? When the idol itself does not have to follow the standard, it's still religious obligation, but that child has to. We think that at that point in time, certain standards that the state imposed on an individual cannot come at the expense of the individual being hard. We think that when children see that, just because I'm not extremely religious, I'm not allowed to play the sport, that reduces the relatability of this, and it's not something that we proposing government is going to defend. Secondly, is our more beneficial towards the nature of sport. Because I've already told you how sport is supposed to be inclusive, but it says it needs to exist above and beyond that. Sports need to be based highly on merit. At that point in time, when we exclude good athletes, but good athletes from entering into a tournament just because they don't pray every day, or just because they don't want to fast, or just because they don't want to wear the hijab. It is extremely important because it reduces the quality of the sporting arena. Opening opposition argues that IOC do not have a duty, but we think they do. First, they think they do, especially when the welfare of these athletes is severely detrimental, when they are forced to be under positions that they don't want to be under. But secondly, the IOC does have a duty, especially upholding the quality of the game, upholding the quality of a tournament. We think that moderation is best achieved outside holding government. When you force a shot at all, in fact, holding people on the ground, people are then more likely to question their values, and you want to have discussion that only happen when you constantly challenge the more oppressive, conservative values that you impose on individuals they never consented to be. We don't think athletes consented to be oppressed, they consented to want to play the game. Holding opposition won that game. From government, yeah.
So, when I see a debate full of conflicts, you talk about the state's imposition of values on all other people. You talk about the harm in the sense that a person's individual right is more important than the right of the state to actually present itself the best image possible. See, the images of the state in the Olympics are the most important aspect of the Olympics. It's not completely about the sport, but rather a representation of every nation at the sport itself. And part of the elements of representation of that nation is the religious aspect of that nation. It is a nation's inherent right to present itself in the image that it wishes to, especially at an event such as the Olympics, at the global arena, because its religion is part of its identity. And in situations when a state's religious identity is shared by a majority of the state's citizens, it is not far-fetched to say that it is a right of the rights of the citizens of that state to be represented in the global arena in a manner that suits them, in a manner that follows their religious beliefs, rather than in a manner that they feel extremely uncomfortable with. And there are tangible harms to that, such as an increased amount of frustration, which will cause further withdrawal from the global arena itself. Talk about the circumstances and how each individual is forced into these sports, how they have to fast despite being physically overwhelmed. But then again, they come forward and tell you in the same sentence that there are exceptions. It is an inherent contradiction there. Because on one hand, they are pushing forward their point, it is extremely bad. And on the other hand, they are saying there are exceptions. So on the outside, you see, that point lends itself well. Because despite what they say, it is not that bad. There are exceptions to the rule, which allow for a moderate form of representation of those religious qualities, right? No state is going to force absolute religious representation of those qualities. The reality of the situation is when the state imposes these religious representations upon the family, it is in a moderate form. They are not going to actually fast it out and drop this back. Talk about how it does states from sports. You see, it does. They talk about how it will not deter states from sports. But you see, when you actually force states to present themselves in an image that suits you, such as highlighted by now, when you actually force states to present the image that you dictate to them, rather than allowing organic change to happen, you lose credibility to that organic change that happens itself because of the imagery related to that organic. What happens is, if the United States decides to force all of these regulations as part of its membership in the Parliamentary Council, when you force all of these religious restrictions within the country itself, it will be viewed as being subservient to the interests of the United States. It will be viewed as being submissive. And you see, it is against the national pride of that nation itself to be submissive to these foreign values and violates the individual rights of every nation involved to actually represent itself in an image that suits it, not an image that is dictated by other nations and violates its sovereignty.
Sir, are you then, was that tell us why you're okay with a community or with a state that denies an athlete from participating in a tournament because the athlete does not want to wear a hijab?
An image a state propagates, especially when that image is held dearly to the hearts of every single citizen in that state, with the exception of those athletes, especially when it is part of a state's identity, absolutely is way more important than the needs of a single athlete. Because even if it violates the needs of that athlete, a state's representation of its image is its sovereign right and should not be disputed because that imagery is part of its nationalistic ideals, right? Now, what they have failed to engage with, they have failed to engage with the Olympic Council needing to be a neutral party in this area. You see, the Olympics have always been neutral, despite world wars that have happened, despite conflicts between the nations involved. Even North Korea is involved in Olympic sports to a certain extent. The Olympics needs to be neutral because it is a medium for unity and racial tolerance. And this motion addresses that in the sense that if we push forward for this Western imposition upon nations that do not wish to relegate their religious values, it violates the stance pushed forward traditionally by the Olympics as an extremely racial tolerant medium for all the nations involved to participate in sports and appreciate the beauty of the games that they participate in. You see, when you force the Olympic community to be a non-neutral party within the equation, you force them to take a stance. What does this do? Well, firstly, add politics to the equation, right? You create an animosity between the different states that participate. Because the reason behind them participating in the Olympics is not completely because of the sport, but because of the feeling of global unity, where every single nation in the world participates within the same event and can present itself in the light that it wishes to, and present itself in the sense that it presents the best image that they think is right, not what other nations think is right. And you use the ability of each individual citizen within that nation actually take the pride in that form of representation if you force these Western image upon them. And what have I done in this case? I talked about why it's important for the Olympic Council to remain neutral in this stance, in the sense that it does not force these nations to relegate their religious values. I've talked about how the rights of a nation to present itself in an image that it wishes to be presented in is more important on a utilitarian basis of pride and nationalism than the individual athlete's participation. That I'm proud of to. Pleasure. There you go.
Okay.